Mother-in-law. Miranda was lucky. How many stories she heard from her friends who literally did not give life to her husband's mother. She called her mother-in-law the kind mother-in-law. Miranda understood the girlfriend's story. Shocked, opened her mouth, and could only that shocked sigh. "Oh, mommies. Can you imagine?" told her indignantly burning eyes. My mother-in-law friend came to visit unannounced surprise, and not before crossing the threshold of the house, immediately goes to the room and checks whether there are clean white napkins under the bed. And if there is even a bit of dust, immediately runs and pokes his finger under my nose, shouting in my ear. A speck of dust on the carpet, too. He brings it to me with a look as if I hadn't vacuumed for a year. "No way!" Miranda shook her head. And that's not all. Then she rushes to the kitchen with an inspection, opens the refrigerator, and triumphantly shouts, "This kefir expires tomorrow." "You're gonna give birth to my son with expired kefir? How many days did you make this soup yesterday? Are you crazy?" Ladutko should eat only fresh, bright, portrayed mother-in-law in nasty lefty voice. And despite the horror of the whole situation, it was impossible to refrain from laughing. Then meticulously inspects the bathroom and toilet, whether the toilet bowl is shining, whether the towels are snow white, whether the washing machine is not overflowing. Then checks how hung her not visible in the palm shirts are in the closet, whether the wife's couture is good, if not too good. In her authoritative opinion, she immediately starts yelling at me. "It's a nightmare!" Miranda only sighed, in the depths of her soul rejoicing again and again that she herself, with her husband's mother, was just fabulously lucky. Even in her worst dream, she could not dream that Cindy had ever raised her voice or said anything not only rude, but even not polite. Her mother-in-law had always been remarkably delicate and tactful, not even sitting around about her grandchildren. Although Miranda's own mother now and then started conversations on the subject at Anatole. "But when are you and Charles thinking of having kids?" "It's about time. I want to study it with my grandchildren. At family gatherings and feasts. Numerous aunts, great-aunts, and others. The seventh water on the vine also settled on Miranda, without any ceremony in expressions. "Miranda, what are you doing?" "When to get pregnant." "What, you're not young anymore? How old are you?" 27. "But you're the one who dragged it out." "Dragged it out?" "Honey, when I was your age, I already went for my third. I was the oldest person in the ward. They used to call me old in the hospital for soup." Miranda threw force to squeeze out a fictitious smile and mumble that little intelligible. In response to questions about when she and her husband will have offspring, were perceived by her painfully. It had been 5 years since their wedding, and still no children. And not because they didn't want to. They did. They just couldn't do it in a nonchalant way. The brutal pregnancy tests always showed a single line. For the first year after they were married, she and Charles hadn't thought about kids, and when they finally decided it was time, turns out it wasn't something that could be done at the snap of a finger. Every month, Miranda prayed that this time it would work, but each time she was met with unfailing disappointment. Girlfriends, friends, and colleagues who had already had babies advised her on the surest and most reliable folk methods to get pregnant as soon as possible. She told herself healing herbs, stood in the pose of a birch, took some Indian legal pills. Nothing worked. After a year of unsuccessful attempts, Miranda finally gave up and trusted the doctors. It seemed to her that now everything would be fine. They would prescribe her some vitamins or injections, and she would be pregnant in no time. How could it be otherwise? Her cycle is regular, almost like clockwork. Miranda has never had an abortion, never contracted any sexually transmitted diseases. So why would she have trouble conceiving? It's probably just stress, and vitamin deficiency. However, after numerous tests and investigations, she was found to have a rather serious pathology, and it was unthinkable to get pregnant with it, even with the help of IVF. Long-term treatment was required, in some places very painful. Again, months of unbearable waiting, a sea of paid tears of hope. And each time her heart broke into 1,000 pieces, which Miranda tried to glue back together again and again with some desperate persistence. Layla had simply scooped herself to the bottom until she was tired.
There were still two options left: surrogacy or adoption. But Miranda didn't want to hear about either of those. And at the same time, she was terribly afraid that Charles would leave her, that one day she would become a burden to him, and he would seriously want his own child of another healthy woman. Her husband assured her that he loved her more than life and didn't care if they had children or not. But Miranda was still terribly complexed and considered herself an inferior woman. She did not share her problems and worries with her friends or relatives. Even her mother did not tell her. More than anything else in the world, Miranda hated being pitied. A tactless question, and she learned to let it pass her ears and ignore it. And if the interlocutor was particularly insistent, she calmly replied that she was a child-free. And even if after the many people twisted their fingers at her temple, but in their eyes there was no that humiliating pity, which Miranda was so afraid of. So, among all those overly curious Miranda, mother-in-law Cindy was just a model of delicacy.
And not intrusive. She always asked Miranda affectionately about Miranda's affairs, but she never pried into her soul or allowed herself a single inappropriate remark, not a throwaway piece of advice or an uncomfortable question. For this, Miranda endlessly respected, appreciated, and even loved her mother-in-law. A more benevolent and decent person she had never met. And it seemed that Cindy was paying her back in kind. Called Miranda nothing less than a daughter. Always cared for her as much as she cared for her own son. Miranda found out that her mother-in-law was seriously ill by accident. The woman hid it from everyone, even Charles. When her son and daughter-in-law came to visit her, she always greeted them with a friendly smile and a table full of food. In the center was invariably located Cindy's signature pie, scattered clean, juicy, with a ruddy fried crust. Miranda could never resist the temptation and would eat as many as 3 slices. But in the last month, Miranda began to notice that although her mother-in-law set the table for them, as before, she looked very tired, almost haggard every time, as if cooking was taking all her energy. Cindy told her Miranda, "You don't have to work so hard for us. You get tired standing at the stove for 12 hours. You don't have to make that kind of sacrifice. Next time, we'll buy our own tea, and that's enough." The mother-in-law smiled with pale lips. "What's the matter, Miranda, baby?" "I feel fine. It's such a pleasure for me to treat you to something delicious." Miranda frowned. "I can see you look tired. You look pale? And there are bruises under your eyes. Do you need more rest?" I will. Cindy waved it off. "I'm so glad you don't forget me. You come. Give me a little. Your daughter will take care of you." And then Charles suspected something was wrong with his mother. Mom had lost a lot of weight, he told Miranda. She perked up. "Did you notice it too?" Here she is assuring me that everything is fine. She looks powerless and unhealthy. That's Mom, Charles sighed. Never admits she's not feeling well, or that she's in pain. Maybe she should get a physical, suggested Miranda. Check her blood, heart, other internal organs. There's no telling what's wrong. Charles frowned. "Do you think it's something serious?" Did Miranda shake her head? "No, but just in case. Maybe she's really just tired. We should buy her a trip to the seaside. It had been so long since she'd gone on vacation," Charles suggested. "Good idea," Miranda nodded. Her mother-in-law, however, when she heard about the idea of sending her south, resisted and argued weakly. Where am I going to go? What else have you thought up? All the household on me and the vegetable garden, and chickens and rabbits? Who will I leave them to? Don't worry, we'll revise the vegetable garden, the menagerie. Charles waved her hand. When I dropped out by after work, when Miranda and the neighbor will help in case of emergency. Cindy's roommate was a cute girl about 27, creepy Christina. After the tragic death of her parents, Christina was raised by her grandparents. But it's been a year since the old men passed away, and the poor girl was left all alone. Well, at least she inherited a house, and the Christinas have been tending the house from morning till night. Now and then I run into Cindy to help her with something or just chat with her neighbors. Earned Christina sewing at home. Not much, but it was enough for her to live alone. Moreover, with a vegetable garden and livestock well fed her. Yes, Christina wouldn't refuse to help. When I hear about my neighbor Cindy, I'll talk to her with a lighter face. Perhaps, if she agrees, I'll go to that sea of yours. To be honest, Miranda didn't like this neighbor of her mother-in-law's. She reminded her of the heroine of the movie Morosco. The girl even talked the same way, broadcasting in a thin voice. Her smile was meek and shy, and in general she acted like a poor sheep. But in fact, Miranda understood that it was not her modesty or her doll-like face with clear, shameful eyes that annoyed her neighbor the most. Miranda suspected that Christina had long been hopelessly in love with Charles, her husband. One day, she shared her suspicions with him, but the husband had thrown Kafir mockingly Christina that. Come on, what love is there? I'm still sleeping with her, and I remember always dragging her after me. When I went out with the boys, she would ask to go to the river with us, or to the forest, or to the night. She's 7 years younger than me. I never thought of her as a girl, more like a little sister. Miranda lifted her lips and said nothing, but she thought to herself that her childhood was over long ago, and Christina was no longer that little girl, but a mature, pretty, mature person. However, Miranda had no reason not to trust her own husband. If he says he does not perceive Christina as a girl, then it is so. The mother-in-law was very satisfied with the vacation at the sea. Miranda and Charles called her all the time, and she told them about her impressions. What a turquoise and transparent sea in the morning. How tender and warm it was. How delicious grapes straight from the bush. Say, how juicy. Ripe peaches on the molded peaches. What beautiful shells thrown out by the wave on the shore. And also on the sand after a storm, you can see shapeless bodies of transparent and Scythian jellyfish. And once a real live dolphin came to the beach, close, and Cindy watched mesmerized as it frolicked and danced into the water, either playing or hunting for fish. The trip seems to have done your mother good, doesn't it? Miranda remarked with a smile. Even through the video link, you can see that her face is literally glowing. Happiness? She's fresher. But I told you things would get better. All she needs is a good night's rest. Charles confirmed it quite well. The day before her mother-in-law arrived, Miranda decided to clean her house. Cindy hadn't asked for it, but it was much nicer to return to a clean house. However, when she opened the door with a spare set of keys, she found that everything inside had been cleaned. And not just clean, but shining clean. Wiped, freshly half-wiped, shiny, scrubbed floor. Not a single speck of dust on the surfaces of the furniture. In the kitchen, all the dishes sparkle like that. On the crumbs, the small tablecloth literally crunches. The bed linen is snow white, lined, giving a refreshing conditioner. Who was it that was keeping order around here? Miranda thought with surprise. And then she answered herself aloud. But who else but our meek Christina? I forgot the carcass. Although she should have been grateful to the girl, Miranda felt a slight irritation. Of what was she trying so hard? as if to please Cindy. Does she want to? She thought with annoyance. Charles, you're already busy anyway. Does Christina still harbor any illusions about him, hoping that one day he would give her his manly attention? Miranda went out to the yard, checked the chickens, the rabbits. Everything was in order, the birds fed and on pop. The rabbits' cages were cleaned out with tufts of fresh, juicy grass sticking out. Everything in the vegetable garden was in perfect order too, not a single. Weeds. The beds were battered. Against her will, Miranda experienced another bout of muffled irritation. Look how diligent Christina is, like a fairy tale heroine. Subconsciously, Miranda didn't trust the girl, because behind the short glance of her huge blue eyes, she could see a snide squint. However, thanks for her help anyway. But let her husband's Miranda not even look back. He's out of her league. And he doesn't cheat on his wife. He only loves Miranda. He and Charles went together to meet his mother-in-law at the airport, and now they were looking carefully for an acquaintance in the crowd of arrivals. A skinny figure. There she was, Miranda exclaimed, happy to be the first to spot Cindy, and waved her over. The woman headed towards them, smiling and leading her small-wheeled suitcase behind her. Charles and Miranda rushed over to hug and kiss her. Suddenly, the worst happened. Right in front of their eyes, the mother-in-law suddenly somehow crushed, gasped, and turned pale. The pallor came even through a fresh tan. And then before they knew it, Cindy began to slowly settle to the floor as if she were a helpless and typical doll. Charles rushed to his mother and managed to pick her up at the very last moment before the inevitable fall, and Miranda looked around and shouted shrilly for a doctor. A doctor! This man is sick! The mother-in-law was brought to her senses at the airport nurse's station. Then, after waiting for an ambulance, they sent her to the hospital. What's wrong with her? It's dangerous. Why did she lose consciousness? Charles excitedly pelted everyone with questions. But he was diplomatically answered. It's hard to draw conclusions yet. We need to make a full examination, take tests, conduct a thorough examination. I was fine. A weak voice reassured his mother-in-law, lying on a stretcher. Just fatigue, change of climate. Dizzy. It'll pass. Take me home, please. But no, Miranda and Charles objected with glee. No going home. Not until we know exactly what's happening to you. You're not going home? A series of endless tests and examinations ensued. Miranda feared something serious, but she didn't admit it to Charles so as not to worry him in vain. But the diagnosis still sounded like a thunderclap to both of them. I'm sorry, said the doctor, turning to Charles. Your mother has cancer? Cancer? The doctor asked him blankly and squeezed Miranda's palm harder, as if seeking protection from her. Mom has cancer. That means she's going to die. What are you talking about, Charles? Miranda was as shocked as her husband. Cancer isn't a foregone conclusion, is it?
She turned to the doctor for support. He shrugged his shoulders uncertainly. Apparently, she didn't want to get her hopes up for nothing. However, and did not intend to scare in vain, too. There are chances always, he said evasively. From the good news, it's not too advanced. We can recommend immediate surgery and then a course of chemotherapy. Will that help? Charles asked hopefully. The doctor averted his eyes. I assure you, we'll do everything we can, but unfortunately, it's not always up to us. Good. Charles cracked his head resolutely. Do this operation of yours, but do it as soon as possible. Please don't procrastinate. Then he shifted a confused, frightened, childlike gaze to his wife, looking to her for support. Can we not tell Mom what's wrong with her? He suggested it, at least not until after the chemo. Let her think she just needs surgery. So we seriously need surgery, but not a word about it being cancer?
Yes, perhaps that would keep her more positive. Nodded Miranda and looked at this doctor. You may not tell Cindy what her diagnosis is yet. The doctor frowned, but then still nodded demurely. Well, it might actually help her to tolerate the surgery better and worry less. Miranda thought about it. I should probably stop by Cindy's house and get some things for the hospital. But there's a change of underwear robe, slippers, washcloths, supplies, hairbrush, and so on. Yes, of course, Charles nodded. Let's go now. Will you help me pack everything so that I don't forget anything? At her mother-in-law's house, Miranda quickly found the items she needed and put them in a bag. Her husband sat on a stool in the kitchen all this time and idly prayed to the wall. I don't believe Mom can die, Miranda, he said at last. His lips quivered like a hurt child's. I don't want her to die. Miranda rushed to her husband and hugged him tightly, pressing his head against her chest. She won't die, she whispered fervently and with conviction, covering his tear-salted cheeks with kisses. Well, of course she wouldn't die. She'll definitely get help from the surgery to fix everything. I believe in it. And her husband continued to shake into silent sobs. I don't know. I don't know how I can keep this from her. I feel like I just clay in her face and she'll know right away, he sobbed. Miranda stroked his hair like a little boy, soothing and comforting Miranda. He raised his twinkling eyes to her. Would you mind dropping off Mommy's things yourself? Today, I'm afraid. I just can't today. I can't stand it and everything's ruined. I can't go out with her knowing about her terrible diagnosis. I need some time to realize everything. But of course, dear, Miranda nodded. I'll go to the hospitals myself. Tell Cindy everything. You really need to calm down a bit. Come to your senses. Thank you, Miranda. He pressed her palms to his lips. What would I do without you? She picked up the duffel bag and asked, Are you going home now? Charles shook his head slowly. No, not home yet. I want to sit around for a while. There's one at my mom's. Think about everything. I need that Miranda. Just to be alone for a while and digest everything. Of course, she nodded softly. I understand. Stay here as long as you need to. I'll go straight home after the hospital and wait for you there. Call me if you need anything. If Miranda had known what would happen at her mother-in-law's house after she left, she would never have left Charles alone. The mother-in-law believed the hastily concocted legend, and the small backbone of the new operation was not worth the exaggerated worry, Miranda assured her in a cheerful tone. Pro will operate and you'll be as good as new. Here are your things for the first time, and then I'll bring more if you need it. Where's Charles? Cindy asked in a weak voice. Yes, his work with. Was Miranda lying? He sends his regards and promised to come by tomorrow to see you. Well, Cindy said, as if to herself. If I really had something serious, Charles would be here now. So my health problems are nothing. Miranda felt embarrassed for deceiving this ingenuous, gullible woman. But she forced a smile and nodded encouragingly. You'll get better soon, Cindy. For now, try to rest and get some sleep. Charles and I will be back tomorrow to bring you something good to eat. When Miranda arrived home, her husband was still gone. He was probably still at his mother's house. She did not bother him with calls, but decided that she would prepare dinner for the time being. I had to prepare something dietary and nutritious for my mother-in-law. In the hospital, of course, they also have food, but it is still not comparable to home food. While Miranda was busy in the kitchen, washing, peeling and chopping vegetables, cooking chicken broth, time flew by, and the unhappy thoughts subsided by themselves. But evening came. Dinner was long since ready. Charles still hadn't returned. Shocked, Miranda sent him a message. Where are you? He didn't answer right away. Same place at Mom's house waiting for you for dinner. The message was marked red, but this time Charles was silent for a long, long time. Finally, he wrote, I think not. For now, I want to stay here at my wife's and go to bed without me. I'll be home late. Good night. Trying not to show how upset she was, Miranda also said goodnight and sighed. She didn't feel like eating alone. She studied for a long time on a bed, which was terribly empty and cold without her husband, waiting for Charles and trying in vain to fall asleep. Every now and then, Miranda returned her thoughts to her mother-in-law's illness, to the forthcoming operation. She was truly worried about Cindy and wished her a speedy recovery. But still in her heart, she was afraid that there was little chance. It was scary to imagine how Charles felt. She was his mother after all? Sleep did not come until morning, when the pink rays of dawn began to shyly break through the horisar, through the curtains on the windows. Miranda fell into a saving oblivion and woke only when she heard a sound. Turning the key in the lock of the key, she sprang from her bed as if challenged. Charles had come in. But what time is it now? Glancing at the clock, Miranda couldn't hold back a surprised exclamation of, wow. It's already an hour. So Charles didn't sleep at home at all. Hurriedly throwing on a silk kick, Miranda jumped out to meet him and almost shrieked in shock. Charles reeked of booze from 2 meters away, and he was barely on his feet, staggering and clutching at the walls. Are you drunk? Miranda asked idly. It was obvious enough, though. It was just that she had never seen her husband in such a state and was now terribly confused, avoiding his gaze from meeting hers. Charles, strength test. I'm sorry, Miranda. I don't know how it happened. Suddenly, she sobbed pitifully and slid down the wall to the floor, covering her face with her hands. Miranda pityingly stroked his gripped hair. Did you get drunk with Mom? Yes, she asked in a friend's voice. Charles shook his head. I'm a scoundrel. I'm a bastard, Miranda. I have no forgiveness. I'm just a bastard. A real bastard. What are you killing? Miranda held his head against her chest. For a second, she thought she smelled her husband's perfume, but she immediately dismissed the thought. What else is this nonsense in her head? Especially the delirium was such that no other odors could not be distinguished with all desire. So she was probably just having an overactive fantasy. Your reaction is natural and understandable. You're worried, Mother, Miranda consoled him. You have nothing to apologize for. Charles kept sobbing so bitterly and serenely that Miranda was literally heartbroken. She didn't know then that the cause of his tears was not his mother's illness, but something else. The operation of the mother-in-law was successful, and everyone even breathed a sigh of relief. But Charles had changed subtly since the day he'd come home drunk. Miranda herself could not quite tell what that change was, but her husband was different, at times as if he were a stranger. It was as if he avoided Miranda, tried not to meet her gaze, and if he did, he averted his eyes guiltily, as if he were ashamed of something in front of her. In the end, Miranda couldn't even stand it. Why do you look like a guilty child or our walking cat? She exclaimed with her hands. Something had happened. The assistant's husband mumbled nothing happened. Everything is fine. Then why have you become such a stranger? Miranda asked in despair. I'm afraid to even approach you sometimes, Charles muttered. Again, they looked away. I'm the same as before. Nothing has changed. Miranda knew, however, that it hadn't. Well, since Charles didn't see fit to share his feelings with her, she didn't bother to pry. She only hoped that in time everything would gradually work itself out and return to normal. Maybe her beloved Charles would one day become the same as before. However, her husband's changes only worsened with time. Charles became even more withdrawn, sullen, and uncommunicative. A deep wrinkle ran between his eyebrows. He would often think about something, staring at one point. And then his face would have the expression of a man who was tormented by something. At one point, Miranda was afraid that Charles was as ill as his mother, and she cautiously asked him how he was feeling. But in response to her anxious inquiries, her husband only shouted, "I'm healthy. I am perfectly well. Don't get on my nerves like a chicken." She even took offense and jumped a little. Charles, of course, immediately came to his senses, pulled her to him, buried his face in her hair, just as he had done before, and muttered through clenched teeth, "I'm sorry, Miranda. I've completely tortured you." There he goes again, apologizing. Miranda was surprised. What was he so angry about? Then she began to notice that Charles was staying late after work more and more often. At first, she didn't pay much attention to it, especially since her husband reported back sparingly when he returned home. Miranda had no reason to suspect him of deception. However, these frequent, almost daily visits to her mother-in-law eventually began to alarm her. She began to dream again that Charles smelled like someone else's perfume. And it was definitely not Cindy's perfume. Miranda didn't know what to think. Maybe she's just screwing herself up, despising herself for dialing her mother-in-law's number and asking how she's doing. How's her health? And then, as if by the way, she asked Cindy, "Is Charles still with you?" "Yes, Stumpy," the mother-in-law replied. "He's in the garden now. I asked him to water the beds." "Was he watering the beds yesterday too?" "This," Miranda asked. "And the day before yesterday, and 3 days ago, and last week." "Miranda, you're freaking out. What's wrong? Did Charles do something to offend you?" Miranda cooled down immediately. Or rather, she felt like a balloon that had been blown out of the air. "No," she said. "I'm sorry, Cindy. I'm just stupid. But of course Charles didn't hurt me. And of course I'm only glad he's helping you." But as she hung up the phone, she thought deeply. Maybe she should have gone to her mother-in-law's house to see for herself that everything was all right, that Charles was really just helping her mother with her chores and not having another woman. Done and done. Miranda convinced herself that she was only going there to see Cindy. But deep down, she knew what she really wanted
was to make sure her husband wasn't cheating on her, but that she planned to see a mother-in-law at home, hoping to catch her husband with his mistress. That's ridiculous. Charles wouldn't bring a woman into his own mother's house, and she wouldn't cover for him. That's ridiculous. He wouldn't cheat on Miranda at all. Charles did end up at his mother's house. Cindy didn't lie to her about that. Miranda caught an idyllic picture of a peaceful tea party at the table at her mother-in-law's house. Cindy herself, Charles, as well as surprise neighbor, Christina. The same one who kidnapped, like in the movie Morosco, and let Christina have her tea. What's wrong with that?
She just dropped by as a neighbor. But at the sight of Miranda, all three of them were embarrassed, as if Miranda had witnessed something indecent. The mother-in-law jumped up, fussed around her daughter-in-law, as if trying to smooth over the awkwardness of the moment with her lively chatter. Christina lowered her head low, pretending to scrutinize something at the bottom of her teacup. And Charles? Charles paled, then blushed, then exhaled. "What are you doing here?" "I stopped by to check on Cindy's health," Miranda said, feeling pathetic and confused. "I'm still entitled to that." "But of course you are, Miranda," exclaimed the mother-in-law. "This is your home. You know that very well yourself." But at the moment, Miranda felt like an extra. What home? There was a complete sense that she was uninvited and not a very pleasant, unwelcome guest. But I should probably go. Climbing up from the table. Table, this meek twig Christina had become. No one bothered to hold her back. As Christina passed Miranda, a familiar scent wafted up. Wasn't it the perfume whose trail had been lingering behind Charles lately? It would not take long to become paranoid. Miranda was angry with herself. For her husband to get involved with this, lock and key. This is ridiculous. After Christina left, the atmosphere became even more unbearable. All three of them and the mother-in-law, Charles and Miranda, felt awkward and constrained. In the end, after half an hour, Miranda hurriedly went home. Week after week, month after month went by. Her mother-in-law was due for another checkup at the clinic. Now she needed to see the doctors regularly to avoid a relapse. Suddenly it turned out that the disease had returned. More precisely, it had not gone anywhere. It just lurked for a while, and then struck with renewed vigor already on other organs. Charles was scary to look at. Miranda herself could hardly keep from crying when she heard the doctor's verdict. There's no hope this time. Prepare yourself. A couple months, 6 months tops. The end is inevitable. The hardest part was telling my mother-in-law. But as it turned out, she had already figured it out. There was nothing to be done. Palliative care at most. Just to ease the suffering a little, but not to help her get better. This common misery seemed to bring Miranda and Charles closer together. He sought her support again, tried to stay close to her, stopped staying late at work and disappearing in the evenings. The two of them surrounded the sick man with care and nurturing. And they also hired a nurse to be with her mother-in-law around the clock. It was no longer months, but days. "Forgive me, Miranda," my mother-in-law said shortly before she died, when it was already so weak that he could barely move his lips. Miranda never understood what she was apologizing for. A surprisingly large number of people came to the funeral. Everyone in the village loved and respected Cindy. And the deceased? Many kind and warm words were said. Many people wept sincerely. Strange that among the neighbors was not seen obliging Christina. She usually hung around Cindy like that. And now she didn't even come to the funeral. It was decided to have a simple wake right in the house. And everybody came with something. Somebody brought pie, somebody brought pancakes, somebody brought some other moral... Sorry, father memorial treat. My mother-in-law looked at all those gathered from the photo in a funeral frame, and on the photo she was just like alive, young, smiling, beautiful. Miranda once again clapped a bitter lump in her throat and, to hide her tears, kicked out of the room into the kitchen. She even thought of an excuse to replace plates with clean ones for some of the guests. In the kitchen, two neighbor mice, Lisa and Kelly, were scratching their tongues. Miranda didn't like them much because of their penchant for gossip, but you can't kick them out on the streets if they're here. They did not change themselves, and now that they were enthusiastically cooking in a corner by the stove, Miranda didn't notice them, busy talking, and she slowed her step, listening. She thought she sounded hers, and stormed off at the names. Oh yes, also the name of that meekest sheep on the wall. Thank God I had the good conscience not to go to the funeral, Kelly whispered loudly. What a snake of a prick! It was Christina who seemed to have upset the holy innocents. Yes, Cindy, the admirer, was to blame for spoiling her too little, Lisa said in the same loud whisper. That quiet girl has been around cleaning since she was a little girl. She was always looking into his mouth and making eyes at him. Cindy didn't seem to notice anything. Christina was like a saint. On the other hand, you could understand her, Kelly said. She wanted grandchildren for a long time. Was her daughter-in-law a void? A light? Miranda felt the blood burn her cheeks. Daughter-in-law, void, light. That wasn't her. Bad luck, Lisa kissed her tongue. Well, don't make God angry. Miranda is a good girl, courteous, respectful. Well, empty. And what kind of a man? How long will he last with a barren woman? So Charles couldn't stand it. Miranda pressed her palms to her flaming cheeks. Charles couldn't stand to be next to her. What's this nonsense? Here he is, in the room, sitting at the table. He's not gone anywhere. He's with her, with Miranda. He's near her. But still, taking a man away from his living wife is the scarcest thing you can do. Kelly spit in her heart. How did that bitch manage to pull it off? Charles had never paid any attention to her before, and now he'd made her happy. Yes, for a long time, Lisa complained sadly. She could adjust and seduce. These are that meek looking quietly. They are, in fact, insolent lecher. Oh, scarecrow, that behind this angelic, glassy appearance the devil is hiding? Miranda was just about to burst into the kitchen and determinedly inquire what they were talking about. Had Charles cheated on her? Breathe with who? That sheep? She's a wall. No, it was all vile gossip. She couldn't believe such nonsense, but just as she was about to make her presence known and put her neighbors in their place, a phrase came out that made her freeze. And look what a disaster. Miranda, who can't get pregnant for a year. And this bitch had a baby right away. And even twins. Miranda was shocked and clamped her mouth with the palm of her hand, restraining a scream. No one had to. Not by this very quiet wheat, Christina. They're good-looking kids, aren't they? They're so cute, Kelly said with a sigh. They look so much like their daddy. They look just like two peas in a pod, just like Charles. Daughter and son, Lisa confirmed. I can see why Cindy... Well, the CA's of the doll. Still, whatever. But grandchildren? No matter how good she is to Miranda. They're still family. A granddaughter is closer and more precious than the golden daughter-in-law. I've seen Charles. The man's changed. His face has darkened. Obviously, the mother lost such grief before Tolik. He's so gloomy because of his children out of wedlock. He loves his wife and can't leave his children. He loves them too, after all. His own blood. Tears rolled slowly down Miranda's cheeks. She continued to stand with her palm pressed to her mouth, so as not to give herself away with a careless cry or moan. How painful and sickening she felt right now. The truth revealed to her was horrible, as if the blinders had fallen from Miranda's eye. In an instant, she realized the reason for her husband's frequent delays. All these long months, Charles had been deceiving her in cold blood. All this time, he'd had a mistress on the side. And not just any mistress, but one who had given him what Miranda had never been able to give him. I wonder how old his little ones are. Retardation, Miranda pondered. And when he and Christina had started that, by all accounts, the babies had to be quite tiny. Miranda was sure that Charles had hooked up with Christina after he'd found out about Mom's illness. That's when he changed. Somehow he'd grown cold to his wife, started disappearing in the evenings. Which means his kids are no more than a few months old now. Because they found out about my mother-in-law's diagnosis a year ago. I wonder if he was ever going to tell Miranda, or was he planning to lead a double life? Miranda suddenly realized that Charles could leave her at any moment. She realized and gasped in horror. Indeed, what was it that kept him by her side? A sense of duty, a sense of friendship, a long-standing habit. But love must be long gone. And if he really loved Miranda, he could never have intimacy with another woman under any circumstances. And now there's nothing holding him back. In both families, he has the main thing, his little daughter and son, who look like 2 drops of water like him. If you believe the chatter of the gossiping neighbors, it turns out that everyone knows everything. Hey, Miranda felt a burning shame at the thought of it. God, what a shame. All the neighbors know. Everyone has seen Charles go to Christina's, and everyone has seen her belly. Afterwards with the kids. And yet these people looked into Miranda's eyes, smiled, said hello, asked her how she was doing, and they themselves probably in hushed lumps and flattery, laughed at her God. What a blind, naive fool she was. And Cindy's mother-in-law, may she rest in peace. She knew too. She knew, and she didn't say a word. Miranda was sweet-talking. She acted as if nothing had happened, while she ran to her son's mistress to communicate with her long-awaited grandchild. Miranda's information literally crushed the young woman. She didn't know how she could go back to the room now and look people, especially her husband, in the eye. It was unbearable. Did she deserve this? Had she not suffered enough? All she needed was gossip. She had become the laughing stock of the world. Miranda walked briskly into the kitchen, dropped the dirty plates into the sink with a clatter, ignoring Lisa, Kelly. The two of them instantly perked up and stopped. Sheshikov with Miranda to him voice saying, "Lisa, you must be tired, my bird. Sit down, rest. I'm doing all the dishes here myself." Yeah, Kelly's resting. Is this how you've been suffering today? Oh, yes, thought Miranda. Sadly, I did. She suddenly realized that she couldn't stay in this house for another second. The pressure of these walls, the atmosphere of the wake, the shadow of her late mother-in-law, her husband's betrayal, and the all-knowing neighbors were weighing on her. She wanted to crawl into her hole, hide from everyone and swim out. You're screaming your pain. For a second, there was a thought to go into Christina's house, to look into Dina's eyes, and at the same time, to look at Charles's children, to see if they really looked like him, as the neighbors assured her. But Miranda immediately rejected the idea, afraid that when she looked into the little one's shoulders, her heart would burst with grief, shatter into 1,000 pieces. She spread her shoulders and entered the room where the memorial meal continued. Charles perked up at the sight of her. "Miranda, where have you been?" he asked pitifully. "Come and sit with me. I feel empty and cold without you." For a few moments, Miranda gazed inquisitively into his eyes, trying to understand how it was possible. How is it possible to look into the eyes of his wife, assure her that it is bad without her, and a few hours later, look into the eyes of another woman, kiss her, embrace her? Hear and roll the sweet-smelling lips of their children's heads. She hadn't realized before that Charles was such a terrible man. God, how she hated him this minute. She wanted to claw at his face with her fingernails and spit bloody spittle into his eyes again, screaming, "Why are you doing this to me?" Of course, Miranda didn't do any of that. She just nodded coldly at him and smiled demurely. "I'm sorry, Charles. I think I'll go home," she said in an even voice. "I'm exhausted and tired. I have a headache. I want to take a pill and lie in silence." "Can you manage without me?" "Yes," Charles nodded confusedly. Yes, of course, rest. Don't worry about a thing. If anything, the neighbors will help me clean and wash the place." Especially one neighbor, Miranda thought with bitter irony. But she didn't say it out loud. Then, probably to finish herself off, she added, "You can sleep here tonight if you want, with your mistress and the children." Yes, she finished mentally. She's going to be so happy, but her husband shakes his head in fright. No, I don't want to be here. I want to be with you. I'll definitely come home tonight." You should have come back earlier, Miranda thought wryly. Now it's too late. It won't change or fix anything anyway. She still had time to be alone, to recover a little and think things over. She had to decide how to act, how to live her life. Once home, Miranda finally let the tears flow. They rolled and rolled down her cheeks, not wanting to stop. And Miranda cried silently for an hour. She felt like an unwanted thing, a discarded thing that her husband had used and thrown away without regret, replacing it with another, newer one. But she hadn't even thrown it away yet. Charles still maintained the appearance that she and Miranda were a family. But she knew it was all an illusion, a lie. Miranda realized that Christina was far from stupid. She would not openly tell Charles to leave his wife and move in with the children. But she also realized that sooner or later, Charles would inevitably think about leaving, because he had on one side of the scale a wife who was familiar to every detail, not too young, and also infertile, and on the other side, a young, fresh, beautiful mother and 2 children. But would a normal man choose to stay with a boring old wife? Miranda knew that leaving Charles would break her heart, but she also knew that this was not going to happen. And then, after much agonizing deliberation, she made the difficult, but, as it seemed to her, the only right decision. She must set Charles free, untie his hands. Miranda would not wait for him to leave her. She would simply leave on her own. Done and done. In a matter of minutes, she had her things thrown into the suitcase, indiscriminately, throwing everything she could get her hands on inside the suitcase, and then shoveling all of her papers out of the desk drawer. That was it, I think. Hurriedly, afraid of being caught off guard, Miranda Apollo wrote her husband a farewell note before leaving for good the apartment where she and Charles had lived for so many happy years.
Miranda lingered on the threshold and looked back. Her chest ached, a bitter lump rolling down her throat. Taking a deep breath, Miranda pushed open the door. She had no idea where she was going now, planning to spend the night at some inn. And then it would be up to her. Probably get an apartment. She couldn't go to her parents' or her friend's house. That's the first place Charles would look. And she didn't want him to find her. Not now, anyway. It was too fresh, too hot while she was wounded for Miranda to look her almost ex-husband in the eye. Someday they would surely talk, and maybe she would even try to understand and forgive him, but not now.
When Charles finally returned home a few hours later, he found his apartment empty and a note on the kitchen table. I know all about you and Christina, and about your children too. You and I should break up. There's just no other way out. Please, Charles, don't try to contact me. I'm not ready to see you yet. Don't torture yourself or me. You'll be the one to file for divorce. Notice, I sincerely wish you happiness in your new family. No longer your Miranda. 3 years later. In general, Miranda was quite a self-sufficient person. She was hardly ever bored alone. She easily found something to her liking. Reading a book, going for a walk, going to the theater or cinema, going to a cozy coffee shop to drink a cup of her favorite cappuccino. She was not shy about going alone, although many of her friends were embarrassed to admit that they were uncomfortable going to public places without company. If you go to the theater or a restaurant alone, they might think you're not wanted at all, Kathy once told her. What a silly thing to say. Miranda was indignant. It's wild. I go alone because I'm not bored alone. And people will say no one needs anything. Kathy shook her head. It's embarrassing. Who cares? Who cares if I have company or not? Miranda indignantly spat out some outdated notions with her hands. Meanwhile, these ideas work, Kathy objected with conviction. If, for example, you come to a bar in the company of your friends or alone, men are likely to pay attention to the company, not to a single girl. That's bullshit, Miranda. Besides, maybe I don't want men paying attention to me. Maybe I just came to the bar to have a drink and have fun after a hard day. Oh, Miranda's a liar! Kathy joins in. Every woman wants to find the right man, the right mate. No one wants to be alone. Miranda, tired, rolled her eyes. You and I don't speak the same language. I'm afraid you'll never understand me. In fact, of course, Miranda didn't prioritize loneliness or make it the purpose and meaning of her life. But she was infinitely annoyed by these long outdated, but still imposed by society ideas. Grandma without a man is incomplete. She must necessarily someone to stick someone to make a couple. And let the man will be bad, as long as only not alone. What's the point of hiding? After her divorce, Miranda tried several times to build new relationships. She got acquainted with men at work, on the dating site, in the theater or cafes. Sometimes it even came to a date. But each time it ended in total failure. Not because the men were so bad, it was just that Miranda couldn't help but mentally compare them to her ex-husband Charles. And every time, the comparison was not in favor of the new suitors. No, of course, the resentment against Charles hadn't gone away. She was still very hurt by the way he'd treated her. And yet, apart from Christina and the children out of wedlock, Charles was the perfect husband. The one Miranda was crazy about. And now all the other men just weren't up to his standard. After Miranda had left home 3 years ago, Charles had repeatedly tried to meet her and talk to her. But Miranda has always managed to avoid the meeting. "I want a divorce, period," she kept repeating like a madwoman. "I don't want anything more from you. Don't call me. And in general, please leave me alone forever." Eventually, having given up all hope, Charles gave up and agreed to a divorce. He probably finally realized that Miranda would never forgive him. They met only once when they came to get the divorce certificate. Miranda tried not to even look at her husband, now ex. She was afraid that she couldn't stand it, that she would let her guard down, that she would snap, throw herself on his neck and sob. Charles glanced at her, and when they had already received the divorce certificate, he made a timid attempt to speak. "Miranda." He began hesitantly. "I miss you. Stop it." She quickly interrupted him. "Charles, don't. Please. What are you going to do with your life? You and I are divorced. From this day forward, we are strangers, outsiders." Charles immediately shrank back, lowered his head. His gaze faded. "What do you say?" he said, muffled. Strangers? I wish you happiness." And he left without looking back. Miranda hadn't heard from him in 3 years, nor had she tried to find any information. One thing she did know for sure was that Charles was happy now with his new wife and his 2 glasses. Miranda had changed jobs and rented an apartment on the opposite side of town, so that she wouldn't run into the past, even inadvertently. One thing she couldn't consider was that, hiding or not hiding, the past would catch up with her sooner or later. That gloomy fall day, Miranda decided to devote to shopping, to cheer herself up at least a little. Lately, she had become irritable and cried, probably seasonal avidominosis. So Miranda decided to stop by one of the largest in the city and look for a couple of upgrades there. She hurriedly walked by the playground, where kids of all ages were bouncing on the trampoline, jumping into the pool with balls, rolling down the slides, and joyfully broadcasting. Miranda tried not to look in that direction. Children were still a taboo subject for her. After all, her infertility was the reason Charles had started a family on the side. It was still painful for her to think about the fact that she was not able to give a long-awaited child to her beloved husband. The fact that she was infertile seemed to put an invisible mark on her, like the stigma of lepers. Even Clara's best friend, could sometimes say something offensive, without even noticing it. And Miranda would take a long time to digest it and come to her senses. For example, they had been trying to meet for weeks, but Slaga kept postponing the meeting. First from Friday to Saturday, then to Sunday morning, then to evening. "Look, I couldn't stand it in the end, Miranda. Let's make up our minds somehow. I don't have to cancel my plans every time and make it up to you." "What do you need to adjust?" Clara said dismissively. "You don't have kids, do you? At any moment you can fall off. And I have to think everything over carefully and calculate. From daycare and school to pick up lessons, check and feed. You have no idea how much mothers have to worry about." "I don't." "You're right," Miranda confirmed quietly. And Slaga did not even realize that thoughtlessly lapsed into tactlessness, inadvertently offended her best friend. In general, the subject of children, or rather their absence from herself, Miranda still perceived too acutely. That was why she was walking past the children's playground, trying not to look in that direction, not to see happy monkeys with clear eyes and sincere smiles. Suddenly, she thought she heard crying. Miranda slowed down and listened. Amidst the children's humane laughter and squealing, one could clearly distinguish someone's sweaty sobs moving around, sorrowful sobs. A child was crying in it. No doubt about it. But where was he? Miranda whirled her head around, trying to find the source of the sound. There it was. A few meters away from the playground, near the food court, a little girl was crying bitterly. She was a little girl. She looked no more than 2.5, 3 years old. Her blonde curls were shot, her pigtails splayed, ribbons of bandages helplessly tangled and hanging. Miranda looked around, trying to find the little girl's parents nearby. There were none. Without a doubt, the girl was here all alone, probably lost. Miranda walked determinedly towards the girl, squatted down in front of her, and said affectionately, "She, why are you crying?" Rubbing her tears with her glasses, red dawned on her face. The girl looked furtively and sobbed. And I was lost. Well, of course, just as Miranda thought. The mall is huge. There are tons of people here. No wonder the little girl got confused and panicked. Did you come here with your parayurin? Are Tamber tense? Huh, Miranda asked. The girl continued to look at her warily. Daddy says you shouldn't talk to strangers, she said at last. Your daddy is absolutely right, nodded Miranda. So I would like to introduce myself immediately. My name is Miranda. Aunt Miranda, she corrected herself. What's yours? Betty, the girl said. Miranda couldn't help smiling. You're just a little berry. So, Betty, what happened to you? Where's your mommy and daddy? You came here with them, didn't you? No, the little girl's got her head up. I came here with my daddy and with Vasya. Miranda intuitively guessed that Stasia was Mason, and Mason was a boy or a girl, she clarified. This is my blat, Betty explained. Perfect. So, you came here with your dad and brother. Where are they now? Miranda continued to ask leading questions. Everything, the scribe wanted, the little girl explained
ingenuously. Daddy took him to the bathroom and told me to turn him in here. How long have you been waiting? The little girl nodded with a sigh. Raiders.
Her! It read the truest sorrow, mixed with panic. It's been a while. Maybe they'd forgotten me? Taken me home? Miranda shook her head without thinking. How could anyone forget about such a sweet, beautiful girl? Surely they would be back soon? Betty, your nose wiggled right away. Are your pigtails braided? Miranda noticed. Let me fix them for you. The little girl wanted a head. They're not intertwined, Anja said carefully. Daddy just doesn't know how to do them right. Ah, that's right. Was it you that Daddy had a premonition about? Miranda guessed. And what about Mommy? The little girl looked at Miranda in a serious and sad way. Mommy is dead, she said. Oh my God, Miranda gasped. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, little one. I didn't know. The little girl took a deep breath. I want Santa Claus to give me and Asa a new mom for New Year's Eve. Daddy says it doesn't work that way, that Santa Claus can only give me a toy. But I still believe it, she added, fervently and with conviction, clasping her fists to her chest. But okay, nodded Miranda with a sigh. Let's now think about how we can find your daddy. You don't have a cell phone, of course. Of course? No, Betty waved her hands. Daddy says I'm too young. Which of course you don't know his cell phone number. The girl waved her head negatively. All right, but at least what's your name? Do you remember? I said. Betty? The little girl stepped angrily. Her eyebrows furrowed as if annoyed, like Miranda. But goofy. No, I mean full last name, first name, middle name. Last name I know, the girl nodded. Betty? She said. Miranda shuddered involuntarily. Donaldson. It had once been her last name. Her ex-husband's last name. What's your daddy's name? You don't remember? I remember, Betty nodded. Daddy, were Olya afraid? Miranda couldn't believe her ears. Coincidence? There's not many Charleses in the world. She gazed intently into the girl's face, trying to see the features of her ex-husband there, and was horrified to find them. The same cut of the eyes, the same curve of the eyebrows, the same shape of the nose, and the same pattern of the lips. You'd have to be blind not to notice the obvious resemblance at first glance. Your brother Mason. Is that it? A voice suddenly asked Miranda. He's your age. He's the same age as you. Yes, important, nodded Betty. Do I, Tola? And him have our birthdays on the same day? We are twins, she added, proudly. Miranda closed her eyes helplessly. Voices, memories echoed in her ears. Miranda, who couldn't get pregnant for a year. This cunt carried a baby right away. And twins, too. The kids turned out pretty. Nice. They look like their darts or diro dallas their daddy? Just like 2 drops of water. Donaldson Betty and Donaldson Mason are 3-year-old twins. Daddy Charles. God. Let it be some kind of wild coincidence and coincidence. Please. Miranda was suddenly out of breath. Betty, did you say? Said your mom died. Yes, the girl nodded. I don't remember her very well for a long time. What was her name? What was her name? Do you remember? Miranda asked with hope and fear at the same time. Betty nodded again at Christina's mom. It was the answer Miranda had been waiting for and dreading. Mama Christina from the children's fairy tale Morosco, with such a delicate face, huge blue eyes, and a delicate voice. But no sooner had she come to her senses, to digest the thought, than an excited voice sounded nearby, a voice she wouldn't mistake for anything else. Miranda, it's you. She, still squatting in front of the baby, slowly raised her head and stared into her favorite eyes. Eyes she would have recognized from 1,000,000, eyes that hadn't changed much in 3 years. Only in the deepest part of them, but there was a desperate longing. Hello, Charles, Miranda said quietly, standing up. Daddy, I knew you would find me, Betty shouted joyfully, throwing herself into his arms. Paris, I told you not to leave the shop where Mason and I left you, Charles said reproachfully, not taking his eyes off Miranda. The baby came in, I got bored, and went to the side of the aquarium. Then I came back and forgot where my bench was. I went looking for it and got lost. Oh, it's not my fault. And she's cranky, pouting her lips. Aunt Miranda told me 100,000, and you're really in the woods? Charles continued to stare at Miranda unceasingly and greedily, as if he couldn't get a hold of her, the impudent man. She even felt embarrassed by this frank gaze. To hide her embarrassment, she gave a cough and said quietly, Betty told me about Christina. I'm really sorry about that. Please accept my condolences. Charles echoed in a steady, completely emotionless children's voice. It's a shame they're without a mother. And you without a wife, Miranda reminded him. Reluctantly, without her beloved, she almost added, and she didn't hold back. Charles shook his head and spoke slowly, looking directly into Miranda's eyes. Christina and I were never married. She caught her breath. Why? She asked, though it was completely none of her business. After all, what did she care whether they hadn't signed? Did they bannerot? Did they really need a stamp in their passports? Many families live just like that. The main thing is that he recognized and registered the children. Because I didn't want to marry her and never loved her, Charles said clearly. But then how can Miranda with milk in her throat? And moved her gaze to the twins, who already carelessly counted about something with each other and laughed merrily. The children were not hers by immaculate conception. Charles ran his fingers through his thick hair, gripped it nervously. "Look, this is a long conversation," he said. "I could have explained it all to you back then, but you never once wanted to hear me out. In fact, 3 years ago, Miranda didn't want to hear any explanations. She just ran away from the cruel irony and the truth. But enough time has passed. She's not in so much pain anymore." Was she ready to learn that truth now? She nodded timidly to her ex-husband. If you still want to tell me the truth, then I'm ready." 10 minutes later, Betty and Mason were already sitting at one of the food court tables, devouring Getz's pizza fries with great gusto while chatting enthusiastically. Charles and Miranda had settled down at a neighboring table, or they hadn't ordered anything to eat. A bite wouldn't go down their throat, and tart. But Charles had gotten a cold lemonade for himself and his ex-wife. So Charles nervously clenched his fingers, and Miranda admired them. She had always liked his hands, so handsome, so masculine, with muscular forearms and protruding veins, strong palms, and long, strong fingers. Where should I start? Start at the beginning. Miranda grinned softly. "When did you and Christina start your relationship?" "There was no relationship," Charles retorted angrily. "There never was. All we ever had was one drunken one-night stand that I still regret." "No," he contradicted himself. "I don't regret having kids, but I will never forgive myself for sleeping with Christina. I didn't want to, so I wouldn't have slept with her. I couldn't resist Miranda's poisonous spiel. Without desire, it is purely physiologically impossible." Charles, upset, shook her head. "I know you won't believe me, but that night I thought I had you with me." Miranda felt as if she had been stabbed in the chest. "Why would you do that to me?" She exhaled. That hurt. Charles, her ex-husband Gusty, grabbed her palms in his and squeezed them tightly. "Forgiven? Miranda, he corrected himself. "But I'm not lying. It's the plain truth. I stayed in the stone house then. You went to our apartment. I was so fucked up. I wanted to go out. I wanted to climb the walls. I decided to get drunk, and I did. I found a sealed bottle of vodka in my mother's fridge, opened it, and drank like a beast. I just wanted to forget myself. I wanted to fall into a drunken sleep, like a faint, and then wake up and find that nothing bad had happened. That my mother's illness was just a dream. That she was healthy and everything was fine." Miranda shook his palm lightly, as if bracing herself. Not that she forgave him for all the pain he'd caused her, but still, she understood his feelings. "I did fall asleep for a while," Charles continued to confess. "And when I woke up, I found a naked woman's body pressed against me. I thought it was you. Was it Christina?" Miranda asked, trying not to betray her feelings. God, it was unbearable to hear about it. "Christina," Charles nodded. "But I didn't find out until this morning. I was too drunk. The room was too dark, and she was silent, not saying a word. Just stroked me, kissed me, pressed everything against me, also without saying anything. I immediately lit up, started responding to her caresses. I thought, making love to my wife," Miranda added bitterly. "He is with you." Miranda looked at the tears that had come to her throat and quietly asked, "How is she? How did she get into the house?" She had a spare set of keys, Charles waved away. Her mother had left them for her when she went to the seaside and then forgot to take them back. Christina knew I was there now, and she also saw that you had gone away. She decided to take a chance. She came in, saw that I'd fallen into a drunken slumber. She didn't hesitate, immediately undressed and lay down on top of me. The rest was a matter of technique. He grinned bitterly. Miranda covered her face with her palms. "I waited for you. Then you said," she struggled, You were otherwise waiting. She didn't want to go to bed without you, while you were tumbling around in bed with someone else. Charles, please, looked her in the eye again. Miranda, believe me, when morning came and I finally saw who was lying next to me, I almost lost my mind. How I hated myself. I was ashamed to look you in the eye. I knew that if you knew, you'd never read me. Especially since you always said that Christina was not indifferent to me. Yeah, I'm a fool. I didn't believe it. I didn't see it. Honestly, I was ready to crawl on my knees in front of you, kiss your feet, and beg for forgiveness. I was so scared to tell you what happened. I've been trying to find the right moment. In short, I just chickened out in desperation, he added. And 3 weeks later, a radiant Christina informed me that she had taken a pregnancy test and it had come back positive. Charles, barely audible, lowered his head low. Miranda didn't know what to say. The situation now looked very different from how she had imagined it. No, of course not. The pain of the affair was not less, but the circumstances were different. Charles had not deliberately deceived her. It just happened. Somehow she was sure, felt sure, that her ex-husband wasn't lying, that everything was exactly as he'd told her. She suddenly remembered how he had come home the morning after that night, crying and apologizing, repeating that he was a bastard. And she thought he was so upset because of his mother's illness. Meanwhile, Charles continued his unhappy story. I told Christina at once that I did not love her and never would. Well, there could be nothing between us except that night. Of course, I was not going to abandon my child, and I promised to support her financially and to help with her upbringing. I supported Christina during pregnancy, took her to doctors for examinations, tests, ultrasounds, bought medicines and vitamins. I helped to collect dowry for the baby. Especially later, it turned out that there are 2 children, which means that everything had to be purchased in a double set of diapers, clothes, toys. We needed a special stroller for twins and a more spacious crib. What an irony of fate. I dreamed of having children, but it wasn't the woman I loved who gave them to me. And still do, Charles, added quietly. Miranda lowered her head, trying to hide her tears. And your mother, hey? When did she find out? Yes, almost immediately, Charles admitted, with a sigh. How could it be hidden? They lived next door to each other. She soon noticed that I was going to Christina's house, taking her out and bringing her back. At first, she thought I was having an affair. Oh, she gave me a hard time. Mom was so crazy about you. She'd kill me for cheating on you. I had to tell her the truth and ask her not to give me away. Mom kept saying you didn't deserve it. She apologized to me before she died. Miranda remembered. I can see why now. I was a fool, Charles, clutching my head with my hands. I should have told you myself and not waited for outsiders to tell you. That's how it turned out in the end. At your mother's funeral, did you somehow find out the truth? Did one of the neighbors blurt it out? It was bound to happen sooner or later, right? There's no hiding the truth. I kept silent because I was terrified of losing you. And in the end, I lost you anyway. Miranda looked bitterly at her
ex-husband, and her heart ached with pain and pity. God, how much she had loved him before. And it seemed that this feeling had not completely died in her. Yes, Charles was to blame, very much so. But she's good too.
She wouldn't listen to his explanation and just disappear from his life. Who did she hurt in the end? Only herself, and no one better. Because Charles never found happiness in her absence. What happened to Christina? Miranda asked cautiously.
A car accident, Charles explained briefly. She had just gotten her license. She wasn't driving too confidently yet, so she ended up driving out of control in the rain. Thank God at least the kids weren't in the car with her. How old were they, Tian Xin Dang? barely a year old. They certainly didn't remember their mother, as if realizing that the conversation was about her and Mason. Betty looked at her father and smiled. Dad, will there be a young one? Did you promise ice cream? Will she be home? Charles said sternly, and instantly transformed into a caring father. You sledders. It's past your bedtime. You sleep and you'll get your ice cream. Gone, clapped the girl in the palms of her hands, and then shifted her gaze to Miranda. Can Aunt Miranda come to visit us? And the little girl added to the canvas. Charles stared at his ex-wife with all his eyes. His lips nodded faintly, and he looked at Miranda as if his entire fate depended on her answer. I must ask Aunt Miranda, he said hoarsely. Will you come with us? Really? Betty asked. Come on. We have a tasty young Miranda at home, finally unloved, who had no lips. It depends on how slow you are, she said. Do you have ice cream in a cup at home? It's my favorite. I won't go without it. Don't even ask. Do you have it? I got it. Betty was jumping up and down, smiling happily. It's Daddy's favorite, too. The young one, too. He always buys it. Well then, Miranda smiled. Then I'll be more than happy to come and visit you. Somebody's New Year's Eve. Little Betty's wish came true. Santa Claus gave her and her brother Mason a new mom. A wonderful, wonderful, very loving, and caring mom. Because if you believe in something and want it very much, it will come true.